We're on the top of Daf Yomi Pesachim. To be more precise, the last two words on Daf Yomi Aleph. Let's just review. We had the Mishnah in Shkolim that differentiates between a sakin and a kofetz. If you find a sakin, then since it's now Erev Pesach, you can assume that the Bailim, in a rush of urgency, would tovel it, so it'd be tar for the shchita of the Korban Pesach. And this is all in Yerushalayim. If on the other hand you found a kofetz, which is used to normally designated to cut the bones, then you don't assume that the Bailim had any urgency to be tovel it, because the Chagiga of Yudalid has an Iser of Shviras Etzem. And the Gemara wants to derive from this that the Mishnah reflects the Shita of, against the Shita, I should say, of the Chachamim. And according to the Chachamim, there's no Iser of Shviras Etzem on the Karban Chagig of Yudalid. And therefore, perhaps he was going to use this kofetz for the purpose of shechting his Karban Chagig of Yudalid. Meaning there's no reason to differentiate between a sakin and a kofetz. They're both equally designated, one for the Korban Pesach and the other for the Karban Chagig of Yudalid. If, on the other hand, we attribute this to Ben Tema, if he's the author of the Mishnah, then we justify that distinction between a sakin and a kofetz. A kofetz is not going to be used for Chagig of Yudalid, because Chagig of Yudalid, by virtue of the Hekesh to Pesach, is also Asur be Shviras Etzem. Hence, we prove from this Mishnah that according to Ben Tema, the equation between Chagigas Yudalid and Pesach goes as far as to include an Iser of Shviras Etzem. The Gemara rejects that proof, and the Gemara suggests that you can square this Mishnah with the Rabbanan. Let's say it was a case where Yudalid coincided with Shabbos. There's no Karban Chagigas Yudalid to be Docha Shabbos, as we saw in that Mishnah. Hence, he has no urgency in being Matayar his kofetz. Even though, again, he could use the kofetz for his Chagiga, and according to the Chacham, he's allowed to break the bones. But what's the urgency? He is not going to shech the Chagiga of Yudalid in any event because it's Shabbos, and Chagigas Yudalid does not override the Shabbos. Gemara objects to that because of the Sefer. The Sefer says that if the 14th of Nisan overlaps with Shabbos, then in such case, even in the case of a kofetz, he can assume, the finder, that the loser had been tovel the kofetz because he needs it for the Karban Chagiga. Now, what does that mean he needs it for the Karban Chagiga? The Chagiga is not Docha Shabbos. But the answer is, he needs it for the 15th, which is called the Chagigas Chamesh Asar. There certainly is no Iser of Shviras Etzem in the case of Chagigas Chamesh Asar. And since Shabbos is the day before Chamesh Esrei, because the 14th was Shabbos, he doesn't have the option of being tovelit on the 14th. The Iser Tfilas Kalim applies on Shabbos. Therefore, he must have been makdim to the 13th, foreseeing Ezu Chacham Rasanola that on the 15th he's going to use this kofetz for his Chagigas Chamesh Esrei. And the Gemara says that from the fact that the Sefer says that in both cases, whether he found a sakin or he found a kofetz, he can use them without being tovel them, meaning that the Bailam would tovel them out of a sense of urgency. It must be that the Reish is talking about a case where Yudalid was on a weekday, was on a chol. Because otherwise, you have a stira between the Reish and the Sefer. In the Reish, we said you find a kofetz and you have to be tovel. In the Sefer, you find a kofetz and you don't have to be tovel. And the only way we could justify that distinction is that whereas in the case of the Reisha is Yudalid on a weekday, he's not going to be in any rush in that case to be Tovel and be Matire his Kofit because Etzem Lo Sidrubo. He's going to use it for what? For the Chagigas Yudalit? No, no, no. You don't use that kind of a knife for the Chagigas Yudalit, like uh, assuming like Ben Tema, who holds that there's an Easter of Shvius Etzem. So that we are forced to assume at this point that the Mishnah in the Resha is talking about a case of Chol, and here, according to the Rabbanon, we don't have any reason why we should distinguish, as the Mishnah in fact does, between a Sakin and a Kofit. Sakin for Pesach, Kofit for Chagigas Yudal. There's no Isser of Etzem Lo Sishbu. So the Gemara now, on the top of Daf Ayin of Beis, is going to make another valiant effort to try to reconcile this Mishnah with the Chachamim. Ella Sheba, we're on the top now of Ayin of Beis, Bimaruba. The case that we're dealing with in the Reisha is where there are very few members of the Chabura, and therefore there's plenty of meat to go around, and they're not going to be makriv the Chagigas Yudalid as a supplement, because again, we're holding now Chagigas Yudalid as a Rishus, and it's only brought in a case of a small amount of Korban Pesach, which means that we need to set up the eating of the Chagigas Yudalid before the Pesach so that he'll eat the Pesach Alasova. But in this case, it's Meruba, he's got plenty of meat from the Korban Pesach. He'll definitely reach the state of Kedei Svia, of Alasova. So once again, the Bailam have no vested interest in being makbil their kofits on Yud Gimel for the sake of Yudalid, because on Yudalid there is no Chagigas Yudalid in this case. So the Gemara asks the naive but obvious question: Mino Yadi? How did the Bailam know in advance on the 13th of Nisan that it's going to be a situation of Meruba, that there'll be plenty of meat to go around, and we don't have to supplement it with the Chagig of Yudalid? It could be that at any moment more people will join the Chabura, and once you have a ribu in the Chabura, you'll have a miyut in the basar. That, right? It's an inverse equation, and therefore they're going to shecht. They should be prepared for all possible scenarios, and the possibility is that more people will jump on the bandwagon, join the Chabura, and therefore each person in the Chabura will get a smaller portion of the Korban Pesach. They need to supplement it with the Chagigas Yudalid. And if that be the case, then if they're considering, that possibility, and they have to consider that possibility, they would certainly urgently be Tovel the Kofitz. Why does the Mishnah say in the Reisha that you're not allowed to use this Kofitz without being Tovel it? You don't assume that the Bailam would Tovel it. The Ella says the Gemara Sheba Betuma. We have to reject that possibility that it's a case of Meruba, but maybe it's a case of Betuma. And we're not makriv the Chagig as we saw in that Mishnah Betuma. Once again, the Gemara has sof mino yadi. How did the Bailam know as early as Yud Gimel that on Erev Pesach it's going to be a case of Rov Tzibur Tmeim and they won't need the Kofitz? And the Gemara answers that it was public knowledge. Why? The Misnasi. It was a public figure, in this case, the Nasiya Sanhedrin, or the Melech, who died. Everybody has to participate in the Kvura, all of Klal Yisrael. You'll have Rov Tzibur Tmeim. And if Rov Tzibur Tmeim, then the Bailam don't need the Kofitz on Yudalid. They're not going to be Makriv a Chagiga, because, as we said, Chagigas Yudalid does not come B'tumah. Only the Korban Pesach comes B'tumah. And therefore they don't need the Kofitz. So the Gemara clarifies, the Mis Nasi Amos, when did the Nasi actually pass away? In this, again, hypothetical model. If he died on the 13th of Nisan, and that's the time for Taras Kalim, is Sakin Lamali Lamitvale. Why would the Bailim be so urgent about being Tovil the Sakin? They knew already that this carbon is going to come B'tumah because already on the 13th they were forewarned when the Nasi died. Therefore, why does the Mishnah say that if you find a Sakin, you can assume that it was in the state of Tara? You could go ahead and shech the Chagig of Yontif. Why is that so? After all, if it's Pesach above B'tumah, so then there won't be a Chagigas Yudalit. What happens is that he died on the 14th. They were already Tovel their Kalim on Yud Gimel, knowing that they would use the Kalim, meaning the Sakin, for Shlitas HaPesach. So the Gemara says, if that be the case, Maishna v'Sakin dematbil, Maishna v'Kofitz delo matbil. What's the difference between a Sakin that you were allowed to assume that the Bailam would matbil it, and a Kofitz where we don't assume he was matbil it, and therefore the person who finds it has to be matbil it? If the Pesach is ba b'tara, makrivim imo chagiga. We're going to bring the chagiga together with the korban Pesach b'tara. And again, you can't assume that he knows it's going to be a Maruba case. So that what's going to happen is that they didn't know that the Pesach was going to be on the 13th. The Pesach was going to become B'tumah. They thought it was going to become the Tara because it was only on the 14th that the Nasi died. So in anticipation of a korban Pesach Tara, again, that didn't meet out, they certainly were makbil both their sakinim and their kfitzim for the sake, or kofitzim, I guess you'd call it, for the sake of the chagig that accompanies the korban Pesach, or might accompany the korban. So the Gemara answers, Lo tzricha the Nasi goses b'shloshasar. The Nasi was in that state in which he was very precarious whether he'd live or not, whether he'd survive or not, on the 13th. Nobody knew clearly whether he would die and there'll be makriv the Pesach B'tumah, or he won't die, Baruch Hashem will survive, or at least he won't die then, he'll die later on, and therefore there'll be makriv the korban Pesach B'tara. Oh, now let's see if we can calculate the difference between the sakin and the kofos. Sakin, the chad sfeika. What does the Bailam think? There's only one suffix. It could be that the Nasi will die and lo yitztarech to, but they don't need the sakin to be in the state of Tara because they're going to bring the korban Pesach B'tumah. They will not accompany the korban Pesach with the Chagigas Yidalid because Chagigas Yidalid does not override Tumah. And therefore, matbele. Since there's a possibility that the Mitzvah Hashem, we hope and pray that the Nasi will survive and it'll be a korban Pesach B'tara, they want to make sure that they have a kofitz for the accompaniment of the Chagig. But when you find a kofitz, let's just think about this. Really trace fake. With regard to the sakin, there's only one suffix. Either the Nasi will die and they don't need Tara, of course it'll be brought B'tumah, Rov Tzibur. But maybe the Nasi will survive. On the side that it'll survive, they need the sakin to be B'tara, because that's going to be a korban Pesach B'tara. So that because of that one suffix, they're certainly going to be machmir and see it as urgent that on Yud Gimel they'll be tovil their sakin. But with regard to the kofitz, it's really two sfeikos, as we indicated before, because it's possible that the Nasi will die and then they won't bring Chagiga on Yudalit. And in fact, they won't even be able to bring it on Tesvav because the carbon of Tesvav is is not ba betum at all. It's only the Korban Pesach's ba betum. And even on the tzad that he doesn't die, it's very possible to be a Pesach Meruba. Right now, there are very few people registered for this Chabura. So in that case, there are two sfekas, two reasons, independent one of the other, to assume that there will not be a Chagigas Yudalit, and therefore there's no need for the Taras HaKofos. Reason number one is because the Nasi may die, and then they'll bring only the Korban Pesach, and not any Chagigos at all. And even on the tzad that the Nasi will survive, there's another reason to say why they're not urgently running to be matbil their kofits, and that is because who knows if the Pesach is going to need a Chagigas Yudalit as an accompaniment. We don't know whether it will be Meruba or not Meruba. And in a case of Aruba, there's plenty of meat to go around, and they don't need the Karban Chagigas Yudalit. Gemara now quote the Brisa that disagrees with some of the dinim that we saw in our Mishnah regarding Chagigas Yudalit. Tanya Yehuda ben Dortai Piresh. Piresh means he separated himself from the Chachamim as a dissenting view, because the Chachamim said the Chagigas Yudalit does not override the Shabbos. Hu v'Dortai b'no, and his son was named, I guess, after his grandfather, Dortai. And v'holach v'yoshav lo badaro. Why did they uproot themselves and go south? They didn't want to be chayav in the Korban Pesach and the Chagiga, because they knew that the Chachamim, in a case of Tumah, or in a case of Shabbos, they knew already, perhaps, if they got the word about Kiddush HaChodesh, that Yudalit that year would fall on a Shabbos, and they would not be allowed to bring the Korban Chagiga, so they didn't want to be chayav in Pesach, because they held that Pesach and Chagiga is like a package deal. If you're chayav in one, you're chayav in the other. Amar, if Yisrael v'nei malo chagagtem chagiga b'Shabbos, when Eliyahu Mitzvah will come, and he'll ask them, why didn't you bring the chagiga on Yudalit when it was Shabbos? Mahem omrim lo. And Tmahani al Shnei Gedoli Ador Shmai Vavtali Shem Chacham Gedolim v'Darshanim Gedolim V'lo Omer Lahem Yisrael Chagiga Dochas HaShabbos. This Yehuda was so convinced, he didn't understand how the Gedoli Ador Shmai Vavtali would not have come to the same conclusion, and we'll see why he came to the conclusion that Chagiga, like Pesach, overrides the Shabbos, and they won't bring. So he doesn't want to be around when Eliyahu comes and asks, why didn't you bring the Chagiga? He's down south. He's not chayav in the Korban Pesach. He's berichuk makom. Amar Rav, my time ben Dortai. The pasuk says in Dvarim Tezayin, "V'zavachta Pesach l'Hashem Elokecha tzon ubakar." What's going on over here? We're talking about a Pesach. Pesach doesn't come with bakar. It's either from a lamb or a kid, meaning a young goat. So what's bakar doing here? Ella tzon ze Pesach ubakar zu chagiga. The Torah here is saying v'zavachta Pesach and v'zavachta chagiga, because the extra word of bakar could only be referring to the chagiga. Chagiga is ba mina bakar, like any shalom. Yomer achmonim v'zavachta Pesach. In other words, the Torah is telling us that this chagiga is called Pesach, and whatever dinim apply to Pesach apply to the chagiga. Pesach is docha Shabbos. Chagiga is docha Shabbos. So Rav Ashi vanan time the pruchim neku v'nifrosh. He says, do we have to explain the reasoning of the Chachamim, they call the Parshim, who rejected Ben Dortai? It's not even necessary. Why? Because Kra Lichra Rav Nachman Udiyo. So we know that this pasuk of Bakar is coming to teach us the halacha formulated by Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman over Rabbi Baravua Minayin Levosar Pesach. So it means he was makdish a lamb for the Korban Pesach. It got lost, so that he had to be mafresh a second set as a replacement of the first one, and then he finds the first one. So how do we know shekariv shlamim, that a fallback position of a Korban Pesach, in event that it wasn't brought in its time because it was lost, is that it becomes a Korban shlamim? Shenemar, because the pasuk says, "V'zavachta Pesach l'Hashem Elokecha tzon u'bakar." L'chi Pesach min ha'bakar ba, the same question. Why does the Torah mention bakar in the context of a Korban Pesach? Hello, ein Pesach ela min ha'kvas min ha'izim. Ela mosar ha'Pesach yehei lidavar haba min ha'tzon u'min ha'bakar. That in event that the Korban Pesach is lost, then it's designated as a shlomim, meaning which could come either from a tzon or a bakar. So in other words, it doesn't mean that the Torah is actually talking about bakar, because the Torah is talking about that which was designated as a Pesach, so it can't be bakar. What the Torah is telling you is that this Pesach might in fact have the same din as shlomim, which means it can be brought minat. So it's a theoretical bakar. It's a theoretical description of a Pesach that now can become like a carbon that's brought minat bakar, meaning like a shlom. It becomes by default a carbon shlom. The Rabbanan who reject Yehuda ben Dotoy, they hold that all karbonos chagiga did not override the Shabbos, and that's true even for the chagiga of Tesvav. Is my timer? Why is that carbon chagiga Tesvav, insofar as it's a classic time urgent carbon sibur? Why shouldn't it be dochet Shabbos? My timer lo dochi Shabbos. Avadi carbon sibur. It's like a carbon Pesach, and it's brought together with the whole tzibur like a carbon Pesach. It has a separate set time. Why shouldn't it be Dom Shabbos? Omar Rabbi Eloi, Mishum Rabbi Yehuda ben Safra, Omar Kra, the pasuk says with regard to the akrav of Chagiga and Chag HaSukkos, v'chagosem oso Chag Lashem Chivas Yomim Bashana. Wait a second. Sukkot is really 8 days long, not 7 days long. Shiva, Shmonahav. Even on Shmini Atzeres, you can be makriv the Karban Chagiga. So why does the Torah speak about 7 days when in truth it's 8 days? Now the Gemara in Chagiga on Daf Tes says that if they didn't bring the Karban Chagiga on the first day of Sukkot, then he can go and bring the Chagiga for the next 7 days, including Shmini Atzeres. We know that within an 8-day period, there's no chance that there won't be a Shabbos. In other words, there definitely will be one Shabbos within that 8-day period of time. And on that Shabbos, we're not going to be able to bring the Karban Chagiga. Hence, the Torah tells us the Chagotzem, that Karban Chagiga can only be brought maximum for 7 days. He also Ravin, when Ravin came to Bavel, Omar Amarti L'fnei Rabosai, I asked the following question to my Rebbe: why does the Torah guarantee us 7 days for the Karban Chagiga? What happens if you have 2 Shabbosim within 8 days? Kigon Shechal Yontif Rishon Shel Chag B'Shabbos. If the first day of Sukkot is on a Shabbos, then Shmini Atzeres will also be on a Shabbos 8 days later. That means that you have to subtract 2 days from the Chagiga, reducing it from 8 to 6. How do you get 7? Amar Abaye, Avin Tichla, that's a phrase to mean Hashakul, meaning he's in bad shape. Lema Ki HaMilsa. Somebody who is in that state of Tichla is capable of asking such a question. Lo mishkachas lo klal Shiva Isa Barov Shanim. He says the following, that Shmona could never be, and therefore the Torah reduced it to 7. In most cases, in most years, you'll have 7 days. And once in a while, in a myriad of cases, you'll have 6 days. But Shiva Asi Barov Shanim, in most cases, you'll have Shiva, and therefore the Torah is talking about Rov cases. He says in the translation of the word Tichla, Ovin Hashakol. Hashkol, Ovin Hashkol. He says, Ovin Ushmo Shal Ravin, right? Ravin's name was Ovin. And Ravin is a short form of Rav Ovin. Okay, so that's based on Sefer Yuch. And why is he called Shakul, which is grieving? Shemesu Bona B'chayev. The Marshal says that never he lost his children. Omar Ula Omar Abulazar Shlomim Cheshchaton. The Erev Yontif Eino Yotze Behen Lo Mishum Simcha V'Lo Mishum Chagiga. If he took a carbon shlomim and he shechted it on Erev Yontif, he cannot use it neither for the fulfillment of his mitzvah of Shalmei Simcha nor for his mitzvah of Chagiga. So again, even though he's going to eat the basar of this carbon shlomim on Chag because he shechted it on Erev Chag, so the Gemara explains Ula's statement, Mishum Simcha. Why isn't he Yotze mitzvah Simcha? Tichsiv, because when the Torah commands the Jewish people when they enter into Israel to build a Mizbeach at Har Eval, so the pasuk says in Dvarim Chav Zayin, V'zavachta Shlomim, V'achalta Sham, V'samachta. Now notice, with regard to Shalmei Simcha, the Torah is telling us both V'zavachta and V'samachta in the same pasuk, in the same breath. V'zavachta refers to Shechita. Is Be'inon Zvicha, here we're on the top of Ayin Aleph Amid Aleph, B'shas HaSimcha V'leka, that the Shechita itself could not be on Erev Yontif, but rather on Yontif, when you could fulfill the mitzvah of V'samachta. So V'samachta is qualifying V'zavachta and establishing that the V'zavachta has to happen at that time period when there's V'samachta. Okay, fine. So there's no way that he can be Yotze his Shalmei Simcha, even if he eats the meat. But Mishum Chagiga, why isn't he Yotze the mitzvah of Chagiga? And the answer is, Havi Dover Shebechova, Bechol Dover Shebechova, Hediboa El Min HaChulin. We have a principle that you cannot designate an animal for a carbon and use it for another carbon to fulfill another chova that you have. And in this case, once he had designated this as a carbon shlomim, he can no longer use it and rededicate it for a carbon chagiga, because now we're talking about a carbon chova. Now this principle is recorded by the Gemara Menachos, that when you behave, you were magdish behema, you cannot use it for another carbon. You have to take it from chulin and designate it for that carbon. And therefore, we're talking about chagigas tesvav, which is a carbon chova, and you have to separate and designate a chulin, a carbon of chulin, for a behem of chulin for the carbon. So I just wanted to emphasize that point. I'd left it out, that we're talking about a chagig of tesvav, carbon chova. So that's where we're going to end for today. And Amir Sim tomorrow we'll have Daf Ayin Aleph, and we are up to Lema Misayel. Thank you very much.